This is episode 13 of the podcast Communicate Like This. Episode 13 is titled The 5 Whys, Non-Participants, and 50-50 Communication. Picking up from the cliffhanger in episode 12, we'll talk about how you can best deal with someone who hasn't yet learned these effective communication tools when you're in an argument or a discussion. We'll also discuss the tool called the 5 Whys and how it gets to the root causes of issues. Last, we'll talk about the concept that all effective communication is 50% sender and 50% receiver. These are all important to help you along that path of continuous improvement. Let's start with the 5 Whys. This is a tool to drill down to the root causes of problems. You start by identifying a problem. Then you ask, why is that? When you arrive at an answer, then you ask, why is that? Then simply rinse and repeat 3 more times. Often you will get to your root cause before the 5th why. Sometimes, with complicated things, it may take 6 or 7 whys. The key here is to be dissatisfied with surface symptoms. Notice how I avoided the word not in that sentence? That more positive approach comes from episode 12. Basically, the 5 whys is like an obnoxious child that continuously asks, why, Daddy, why? Why, Daddy, why? Except often, unlike that precocious child, you're actually interested in getting to the root cause of whatever issue it is. Let me give you a real-life example of root cause identification from a listener of the podcast named Kat. She was able to summarize her problem pretty clearly. Xavier, my son, can't find toys to play with that he likes. So, Kat started down the 5 whys path. The answer to the first why for why Xavier can't find toys to play with that he likes was that the toys are not put away in the toy box. The answer to the second why of why aren't the toys put away in the toy box was that the toy box was already full of toys that Xavier didn't play with. The answer to the third why was that the old toys hadn't been cleaned out to make room for new ones. Why was that? For the fourth why, answer, because I work 2 jobs and haven't made the time to clean out the toy box. Why was that? Well, it's not an urgent concern like other everyday needs. Why was that? Well, I hadn't made a prioritized list to complete different tasks around the house. Why was that, Kat? Well, daily exhaustion from working 2 jobs, taking care of a spouse, a kid, and a dog. So, we arrive at the root cause for Kat. Daily exhaustion from working 2 jobs has caused her to not make a list of different tasks to be completed around the house, like cleaning out Xavier's toy box. But identifying the root cause isn't enough. You can't stop there and be satisfied. Why? Because it's all about that action, boss. So, Kat came up with a couple of action items that she could employ after months of stress about toys all over the house. First, she prioritized making a list of tasks to complete around the house. Second, she actually made that list, putting her words into actions. At the top of the list was to clean out the toy box. Third, and most key here, is that she actually put action behind those words too. Then her last countermeasure for the problem was to resolve to clean out the toy box every 6 months. I don't know if she's been able to do or put that action behind those words, but my guess is that she has. Kat, if you're listening to this, please get back to me with your results and I'll share with the team. So, want a stress-relieving tool for something that's really been bugging you? Find and fix the root causes by using the 5 Whys tool. Kat was able to work through her issue and resolve it essentially without any help. However, a lot of times you'll find yourself in an argument or maybe just a minor disagreement with a friend, significant other, or coworker. that's when things can get a bit dicey if you're not both on the same page as to effective communication and the tools to use. If you're both attuned or aware, things will go relatively easily. Since the other person will already know about the 5 whys, going through that exercise will just be business as usual. Both parties will understand it's not a personal attack, but it is a more objective investigation to fix a common problem that you two have and have identified. Both of you share the goal to not argue, so employing appropriate communication tools will be no big deal because the other person knows that using these tools will help. But if the 5 whys is used on someone who doesn't know about that tool, it could seem like an attack, like that precocious child continually asking why. And that could cause that person to get pretty defensive. This is a situation you probably want to avoid, since a minor disagreement could then turn into an argument pretty quickly. So, how do you avoid this when talking to someone who isn't as steeped in the ins and outs of effective communication as you are? Somewhat ironically, you can use one or two of those tools that we talked about earlier. First, when you're heading down the rabbit hole of an argument, have the awareness to understand that is what is happening and call it out overtly. Stop that conversation and redirect the other person to helping to find out why you're disagreeing. Clarify the disagreement by paraphrasing both sides objectively. Then set the mutual expectation of the next phase of the discussion to find the root cause of the disagreement. Then summarize what you expect to happen with this process, that being to solve the argument. Get that agreement first, overtly, from the other person. Then you're both on the same team with a common goal. Explain what the 5 whys tool is to the other person by saying something like, I learned on this podcast called Communicate Like This about something called the 5 whys. Then explain it to them and start the process. But be sure to get their agreement to participate. Again, with someone who hasn't been taught these tools, it's more important than ever that you increase your awareness of your available tools and then teaching them to the other person. If you aren't comfortable in the middle of an argument that, by the way, has now transformed into 2 people with the common goal of getting to the root cause, to directly say you want to use a given tool and naming that tool, you can always assert the so-called higher authority tactic. That just means that you're not trying to appear to be the authority, but you have heard of something that might help, like the podcast Communicate Like This. Communicate Like This can be a neutral reference of knowledge versus you holding yourself up as the authority and kind of appearing holier than thou. Being upfront about these tools and overtly incorporating them into discussions is important to finding the resolutions. If you can get on this path, congratulations. But don't be satisfied, because often when you get to the root cause, that root cause is in fact the other person. If it's you that's the root cause, that should also end the disagreement, because you'll be able to take that third-party, neutral, non-defensive observer perspective that you've learned about and admit that you're wrong or that you need to do something different. But frequently, the root cause may be the other person who hasn't learned what you're learning. The person may try to deflect accountability and, worse, may get offended in the process, mostly from the embarrassment of being found out to be wrong, which they don't want to admit. Mostly, probably because of false pride. Note how the 5 whys creeped into that last sentence. From a big picture standpoint, what you don't want to do is back the other person into a corner where they almost have to get defensive if they don't understand the non-personal nature of the process itself. We'll get into defensiveness and understanding and preventing it in later episodes, but know that if the other person feels backed into a corner, they need a graceful way out. Of course, prevention of them feeling backed into a corner is the best policy. That's kind of back to Perky's law of the 7 Ps. You'll recall that's proper prior planning prevents piss poor performance. By setting expectations and a summary of your hopeful outcome of the discussion up front before you start figuratively or even literally yelling at each other, you'll go a long way to avoid that in the corner situation in the first place. But if you've sort of won the argument, the graceful way out for them is in your actions and words. Mainly, don't gloat. If they apologize, outstanding. But then quickly make sure they know you're thankful for their apology. Don't lord it over them that they were wrong. Do thank them for their candor and staying involved in the discussion versus checking out. It's talk that resolves problems, not leaving the scene. Acknowledge your part in the whole scenario, since effective communication really is 50% sender and 50% receiver. Take that third-party, neutral observer attitude and move into a description of that resolution, kind of summarizing the points. Start looking to the future by describing what you both could do in the future to try to avoid arguments. That again puts you on the same team for a mutual benefit and strengthens your bond. Let's take a few minutes to discuss the concept of effective communication being 50% sender and 50% receiver. It's particularly useful if the other person is not as steeped in the tools of effective communication as you are. The concept is that in any conversation, all parties are equally responsible to ensure clear communication that is mutually understood. Any conversation really only has two parts: the person that's speaking and the person or people that are listening. One person is sending information and one person is receiving information. Pretty simple concept, until it's not when you look at it more closely. Remember those pesky brain filters and the impact of assumptions on effective communication? They insidiously work to sabotage your conversation. So while you think you may be giving your 50% to the conversation, maybe you're really only giving, say, 30%, because what you're sending isn't actually what you mean. Right away, we have a problem. Or if you're receiving the information, maybe you think you're listening very intently and giving your 50%. But in reality, you're bringing all of your baggage to the discussion and are interpreting what's being said differently from the way it's intended. Now, maybe in reality, you're only giving 30% to the effort, even though you thought you were giving 50%. In total, this conversation is only 60% effective because the sender is giving 30% and the receiver is only giving 30%. By definition, if the participants of this conversation bring to the table less than 100% in total, then the conversation is doomed to failure. As the captain, played by Strother Martin in the movie Cool Hand Luke, said, "What we have here is failure to communicate." That failure that the captain lamented is usually due to the fact that either or both of the parties in a given conversation don't understand that they share an equal responsibility to achieve the goal of mutual understanding. All effective communication is 50% sender and 50% receiver. Think about it. If the sender of information asks the receiver to do A, they finish the conversation and walk away, and the receiver ends up doing B, who's at fault? Certainly the sender likely thinks the receiver screwed up. The receiver correspondingly will respond with, "But you told me to do B." The work that the receiver did now needs to be redone to get the desired outcome. No wonder you're too busy to do your job at work, since you constantly have to redo your job due to ineffective communication. The key tool here is the knowledge and understanding that all effective communication is 50% sender and 50% receiver. I once had an HR manager tell me that statement's wrong. He said both parties need to put in 100% in order to have effective communication. Both parties need to put in 100%. That was his perspective. From my perspective, his analysis looked at the individual components, sender and receiver, as totally separate entities. His interpretation of my 50-50 analogy was that neither party individually did their best, in essence, give 100%, to contribute to the success of the engagement. If each party only puts out 50% effort, according to him, no wonder the communication wouldn't work. So, for clarity, I actually mean that if we want to be 100% successful at effective communication, then the responsibility for that total result is equally shared between the parties. Certainly, each party needs to give 100% from their individual perspective, but from that total perspective, their full effort is each only half of the bigger picture to have mutual understanding. Ironically, with this HR manager, this matter of perspective led to a disagreement between us, even though we both meant the same thing. The use of some paraphrasing or, parroting back in your own words what you just heard by either of us might have corrected the problem, but at that point, I simply disengaged. I deemed it not worth the effort. I'm not perfect, and I have emotions just like anyone else, but I had the opportunity to pull out another communication tool that would have helped, and I didn't do that. That tool is to stay engaged in a conversation if you're unclear or sense that the other person is. As an aside, and looping back to the idea of positivity from episode 12, you should know that I've changed the phraseology of that tool, which used to be, don't disengage from a conversation, etc. With the new language, I've eliminated that negative word not that we discussed in episode 12. So now the tool is stated as stay engaged in a conversation if you're unclear or sense the other person is. To conclude my example with the HR manager, by choosing to end the discussion at this point, he left with the thought that 50-50 was a crock. And I left puzzled why he didn't understand my brilliant revelation. We'd just opened the door to future potential problems that would have to be addressed again, inefficiently rehashing points already made that could have been wrapped up in a single conversation. Let me make a brief point about this new tool I just mentioned, that being to stay engaged in a conversation if you're unclear or sense the other person is. It comes back to awareness again. Sometimes you have to listen to your gut, your inner thought processes, and then act on them. You can't wait until later and say, well, what I should have said was X. You have to act in the now, in the middle of the conversation, if you want that mutual understanding. Yes, I understand the irony that many of my examples are provided in hindsight, but if I was perfect, I wouldn't have as many examples to learn from. So that's the positive side of that equation. Perfection is only the goal, but the practical reality is to make your actions the best they can be without expecting perfection. In this 50-50 proposition, take ownership of your half and then work to make the other's half align with yours. Basically, when you can handle your 50%, then you need to take on more if your partner is giving less than 50%. The total of the sender's and the receiver's amount of participation needs to add up to 100% in order to have effective communication. So if the other person isn't giving their 50% or doesn't yet have a full toolbox to work with, then you need to increase your awareness of where the gaps are, and you, as the more experienced person, need to give 51% or 75% or whatever it is that'll allow you to achieve mutual understanding in the conversation. Actively seek mutual understanding. I'm reminded of a picture I saw of an interaction on the sidelines of a football game where the player, Richard Sherman, was literally screaming in his coach's face after the play while the coach just stood there impassively with his arms crossed. Clearly, this was not a 50-50 proposition, and clearly it was only imparting information instead of listening. It really was more of a short-term stress relief for one person, probably Richard Sherman, but it undoubtedly created more stress in the receiver or the coach. With this one-way communication process, the long-term effects are detrimental to the total relationship and should be avoided. Part of the 50% that you bring to the conversation is around intent. In a coaching situation, the whole time you speak, the other person likely thinks about your ulterior motives. Defensive-oriented people will always be on the lookout for any indication that you'll try to screw them somehow, that you'll try to blame them. Their brain filters will take whatever input you provide and twist it around to fit their preconceived notion of what they expected you to say versus what you did say. In a culture that deals with business issues instead of personal ones, that's less of a consideration. But those pure ideal cultures seldom exist. You need to incorporate the lack of the ideal, into whatever words come out of your mouth. What if early in the conversation you overtly stated that the goal here isn't to assign blame, but to address the business issue that's at hand, or the actual topic that you want to discuss? The goal is mutual understanding, not assignment of blame. I'm constantly amazed by how many people react not to what's said, but to what they think was implied by what was actually said. Negative political campaigns make their hay by deliberately taking an opponent's soundbite out of context, putting a spin on it, never intended by the speaker, and then magnifying the spin. Oh, what this person really meant to say was X, when in fact, that wasn't what the person meant to say. They tell you what they think is meant by the statement instead of actually asking the source what it is they meant. Now, to a large degree, I can't really blame people because a common aspect of human communication involves a deliberate attempt at implication. We're trained that way as a society. Yet, from my perhaps Pollyanna-ish perspective, wouldn't we all be able to get along better if we said what we actually meant? Maybe more to the point, wouldn't interaction with others be better if the receiver of the information tried to clarify their understanding of the information before having some knee-jerk emotional response? Many choose the route to be offended by a statement because of the implication they chose to attach to a statement. That's not bringing their 50% to the table. In fact, they almost turn it into a negative 50% effort. Now, emotions are by their very nature tough to control. However, don't you owe the other person the respect that would say that they've not deliberately tried to offend you? Communicate. Don't react. Use your words. The reality that you're likely to face is that most people don't understand how to effectively communicate. They simply don't have the tools or experience to bring their full 50% to the table. If you bring 50% and they bring 35%, then you've only got 85% effective communication. Therefore, if you're a person who always seeks continuous improvement, you will often need to give more than 50% because it's likely that the other person isn't as attuned or aware of their responsibilities in this whole effective communication process as you are. You will have to have a keener awareness of when erroneous assumptions are present or could be present. You'll need to pick up the other person's slack by not only paraphrasing their comments more than usual, but also overtly asking them to paraphrase your comments, since they probably won't know about paraphrasing. Model the behavior you want to see in others. Stephen Covey provided one thought that falls into the category of bringing at least 51% to the table as the receiver so that effective communication can occur. In his seminal book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that I've mentioned before, he wrote, "Seek first to understand, then to be understood. In practical terms, basically, shut your mouth, listen for a change, understand or question, and then say what you have to say. You might find that what you actually say will differ from what you initially planned if you go through this process. We've covered a lot today. Keep in mind as you're listening to these episodes, and if it gets to be too much info at once, you have the ability to push the pause button to allow your brain to process stuff, and then hit play when you're ready to move ahead. In the famous words of Marshawn Lynch, it's all about that action, boss. Talk to you next time.